we're coming back to the United States, where this week the Supreme Court handed down two of the most consequential immigration rulings of this term, one gutting protections for Haitians and Syrians, the other, though, striking down Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship. Meanwhile, the deportation machine keeps expanding with private prisons, government contractors, and now the military, which has killed over 200 people in strikes on boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, with zero evidence presented that any of them were smuggling drugs. Joining us to break it all down is Jesse Franzblau, Associate Director of Policy with the National Immigrant Justice Center. Jesse, welcome to BT Live.
Thanks so much, Rania and Zoe. Really great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on, and we're going to go ahead and pick your brain on a few of these topics. And I guess a good place to start is the news of the week. We saw that the Supreme Court handed down, as I mentioned, these two huge immigration rulings that came 4 days apart. The first one was on June 25th. It was pretty devastating. In a 6-3 decision, the court said that the Department of Homeland Security can strip temporary protected status from somewhere around 350,000 Haitians and over 6,000 Syrians. And the courts basically, this decision said that the courts basically can't review it at all. Then, a few days later, on June 30th, we have this other 6-3 ruling with this kind of narrower 5-4 split underneath it, where the court shot down Trump's executive order trying to end birthright citizenship, grounding it in the 14th Amendment. So, Jesse, how do we square a court that just gave the executive branch nearly unchecked power to strip status, protective status for hundreds of thousands of people, but then drew this hard line on birthright citizenship? And what do you think, this TPS ruling means going forward for the hundreds of thousands of people still holding status from other countries?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rania. Starting with the TPS decision, it was really an incredibly devastating decision. There are hundreds of thousands of folks who are relying on that protected status. One major problem with the immigration system is that there aren't a lot of real lawful pathways for folks to actually, when they are fleeing danger and fleeing violence or fleeing environmental destruction. A lot of folks on TPS are fleeing also environmental devastation, hurricanes, earthquakes. But folks from Haiti and Syria, of course, fleeing, political instability and political violence, are now at grave risk of being targeted for detention, for deportation. But the 6-3 ruling that happened last week means that it also limits future judicial reviews of other TPS determinations for other countries. So you have countries like El Salvador, where you have hundreds of thousands of folks who have been here for decades on this temporary protected status, who could potentially be at risk if the administration now relies on this SCOTUS decision to not renew TPS for other countries. We already have the Department of Homeland Security has already directed employers to stop employment authorization documents for folks from Haiti and from Syria. So putting those folks at further risk in that way. It's a really crushing decision. And then also that same day, it's really worth mentioning there was another really devastating decision from the Supreme Court. Another ruling called Mullen versus El Otro Lado. This is a case that organizations such as National Immigrant Justice Center have been involved in trying to protect the right of folks who arrive at the U.S. borders to be able to claim asylum. What this decision did also the same day essentially said that that the administration largely can turn back people arriving at the border. So people who are seeking asylum, fleeing other countries, fleeing political violence, can be essentially turned back. This was a really crushing decision. A lot of these, laws come from, when decades ago the U.S. would, turn back refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe who were fleeing Nazi Europe, and were turned back and went back, to meet their peril. there were laws, set in place to prevent that from happening, and the SCOTUS decision that happened the same day as the TPS decision rolled back those protections. So that day was a really crushing blow to the protections of asylum seekers, of refugees, of people seeking protection, and then squaring that with the positive decision on birthright citizenship. Obviously, that is a very positive development, but it is quite terrifying that it got that far. This effort to strip birthright citizenship in this country got that far, and that it was a 5-4 decision, a very close decision, is quite scary. So obviously, that's a pretty concrete, almost should be a no-brainer to protect that right of folks. But the fact that it got so close is very frightening. So now, hundreds of thousands of people lacking protection who are going to be more susceptible to this mass immigration enforcement machine.
Yeah, and I would just add regarding the birthright citizenship, the ruling kind of was like a launching pad for right-wing members of the Trump administration and members of the media to kind of then launch their critiques about birthright citizenship. And it has become kind of this like online campaign to attack it. So it definitely feels like it hasn't gone away. And I think the close ruling is quite concerning. But moving to another aspect of kind of this deportation immigration machine, people might remember the private prison companies that used to get hammered in the press for detainee abuse, the GEO Group, Corrections Corporation of America, the CCA rebranded to CoreCivic in 2016. The GEO Group kept its name. And both are bigger than ever, but somehow it's less covered now, even as people keep dying and as these detention centers keep growing and expanding. A Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights report that was published on June 25th found that 52 deaths in ICE custody in the first 500 days of the Trump administration. And this is the highest mortality rate in a decade, more than double the rate under Biden. There were 7 apparent suicides in the first year alone, compared to just 1 in all of 2024. That's extremely concerning. So, Jesse, this is an area of work for you. Can you break down the state of the for-profit detention system right now and its role in the current mass deportation campaign that's been undertaken by the Trump administration?
Yeah, it is, a bit staggering that the private companies behind this mass buildup and expansion of particularly the detention system don't get as much attention, or it does seem to ebb and flow. There's so many, it is a bit of a blitzkrieg of things to deal with and cover. But there can't be enough said about the role that private companies play with regards to the expansion of the immigration detention system. So just starting with the private prison companies, these private prison companies that for decades, were really behind the buildup of the mass incarceration system in this country, have shifted over in recent decades to incarcerating immigrant communities, and they literally use a lot of the same prisons. So some of these, really large-scale prisons, some of them that were closed down actually during the Biden administration because there was an executive order to stop the Justice Department from contracting with private prisons. Some of these major prisons closed down. Some of them just shifted over to ICE detention, mass detention camps. So you have pictures here of the GEO Group. There's a mass facility in northern Michigan in Baldwin that used to be a prison that shifted over to become an ICE detention facility under this second Trump administration. I believe 2 people have already died in that facility since it's open. I believe in the last year. There was another facility down in Kansas run by CoreCivic that was also a former prison. That CoreCivic has been trying to flip over to an ICE detention prison for many years. They've gotten very close to being successful with that. And these companies, they lobby intensely. So every time there is a funding bill in Congress, every time there's appropriation cycle coming, these companies pump millions into lobbying members of Congress in order to ensure that they're getting more money for detention, more money for the imprisonment of immigrant communities, and more money for the enforcement apparatus. You also have companies, the big tech companies, when you're looking at the technology that ICE and Border Patrol use to carry out these operations is very reliant on companies like Palantir, who provide really the backbone, the technology, the databases, the software. Companies, even AT&T, Deloitte, have contracts with ICE data broker companies. LexisNexis has a contract with ICE that helps them get information so they can track people. It's really startling how much information LexisNexis has on folks and how much ICE is able to access those. And so when you look at images like Delaney Hall here, which is of course a GEO Group run prison that reopened, or that opened during the second Trump administration, but it's also important to note that Delaney Hall is one of the facilities that during the Biden administration, they started to move that contract forward. And even in the state of New Jersey, which has a state law that has said we don't want ICE detention in our state, but the federal government has basically sided on behalf of the companies to challenge that, and they've obviously continued with detention in that state. And under the Biden administration, they also sided on with the companies in terms of keeping these detention centers going. So it's really important to be able to look at these companies and then look at how much ICE and Border Patrol's budget has just skyrocketed just over the last year. ICE's budget is up tenfold. It's a bigger budget than all of the other federal agencies, bigger than Justice Department, FBI, all these other agencies combined. It's a larger budget than, I think, around the top 10 militaries in the world. It's a really staggering figure. Last summer, Congress gave ICE $75 billion, and they gave CBP around $60 billion, completely untethered funds to very much a blank check. No restrictions. And then just a few weeks ago, last month, Congress gave another $70 billion to ICE and Border Patrol. It's really unprecedented. ICE's annual budget was around $10 billion. These figures are just absolutely staggering, and this is what has fueled this mass immigration crackdown that we've been seeing, for decades, but particularly over the last year.
So, Jesse, I actually didn't even know that CCA had rebranded to Core Civic. It's like the Blackwater of these private prison companies. But it's crazy. They run there's children in these for-profit detention centers. Like, I didn't know about Dilley in Texas that houses families, including children, and houses is a nice way of putting it, in a place where suicides, like these detention centers, suicides are going up because people are obviously being put in extreme human misery. It's really, really, really sickening. And I appreciate that you just went like kind of pretty thoroughly through this apparatus. I also just wanted to ask, there was also HRW, Human Rights Watch, sent letters to two other companies besides GEO Group and Core Civic, and one of them was Acoma Global Services and then Essentra Health. And I know you did list a bunch of other companies that are involved, but what can you tell us about this broader web of contractors that are cashing in and shaping the deportation machine? Because it's not even just the people who are like owning these detention centers that are for profit. It's also like every aspect is privatized and then, beholden to a profit margin, whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about phone calls, whether we're, if you're allowed phone calls. I don't even know if you're allowed phone calls in ICE detention. But what can you kind of tell us about the rest of that apparatus?
Yeah, those companies that you named. So you have companies providing healthcare, as you say, companies providing, the communication, providing, telephones, and providing, some of these ICE pays for. Some, in some instances, people are paying their own way to make calls. They're supposed to allow for communication, particularly with legal counsel. So, they're supposed to, be able to, people inside communicate with counsel. It's persistently a challenge. The National Immigrant Justice Center represents people, around 10,000 people a year. People in detention throughout the Midwest, throughout the country, just facing incredibly grave conditions, and the medical neglect is absolutely staggering. What people face in detention. Often, if people complain about conditions, there is reprisal that comes from guards. People are often sent into what they call isolation, which is essentially solitary. If people complain about medical issues, they can then be sent into medical isolation, which is again basically solitary. Solitary confinement is an incredibly painful thing that folks experience, which international condemnation of solitary confinement has called it torture, and it's still very, very prevalent in ICE detention. There's a lot of congressional efforts to try to stop the use of solitary confinement in immigration detention, as well as prisons throughout the country. But people face really dire conditions. And you have the medical contractors, you have contractors providing guards. Some of these are, companies like MVM, which has been a contractor for the CIA and for the military to provide guards, for black sites and in Guantanamo. They've gotten the business of getting contracts, which include transporting children to and from places that they're detaining people. And you mentioned, daily immigration processing center and these children, these family detention facilities, which are essentially kid jail. The conditions are absolutely horrifying. Several of these were closed down because of the horrible conditions, and of course they've come back under this Trump administration. Oftentimes they use these no-bid contracts, where also these companies have essentially a sidetrack to getting these contracts, and you have this revolving door as well. People like former Attorney General Pam Bondi worked for Geo Group, has a vested interest in making money for Geo Group, had a vested interest, and now is probably making money for them. With them again. Tom Homan, the self kind of called border czar, has gotten money from Geo Group in the past. It's the profit-driven mechanism behind this really can't be understated, and it's really important to focus on it and put restrictions on this. Congress can take action to place serious restrictions to stop these contracts, these runaway contracts. Place serious restrictions before they can open up new detention facilities with new private contractors, and before they can move to warehouses. Because now this is the latest project. The ICE is buying up property because they have such a windfall of money. They're buying up property in different places above market rate. So it's driving up the housing costs. They're buying up property to use warehouses to incarcerate people, some of them upwards of 10,000 people. There's been a lot of pushback against this, bipartisan pushback across the board that has prevented this. They have not started using these warehouses, but it's a constant fight. Since they have the budget for it, it's really hard to prevent this.
It's shocking because you know a little bit about what happens in this kind of massive deportation machine, but really hearing these details is quite shocking, quite disturbing, to say the least. But wow, we are so glad that you are doing the work to bring this to light. And shifting a bit to another aspect of what has been happening, in the past year under the Trump administration, since September 2025, the U.S. has carried out over 60 strikes on boats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. They've killed over 215 people, and zero evidence has been presented that any of these people that were killed were actually smuggling drugs. And we know this is part of Operation Southern Spear, which the U.S. Southern Command launched really under the auspices of the war on drugs. The military will then post footage of these airstrikes that take place as if they're kind of trophy kills, but it's, again, they don't even really know who they're killing. Human rights groups and the governments that have been, of the region have called these extrajudicial killings since they're happening outside of any major armed conflict, and mainstream news organizations have also carried out investigations, which have showed that victims of these strikes have no evidence, that there's been no evidence tying them to drug trafficking in any way. And the same investigations, along with investigations carried out by the regional governments, have shown that a lot of them are poor fishermen that come from poor families in the region. So, this whole phenomenon of these strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific, Jesse, how do you see this as part of the broader deportation and immigration enforcement mechanism and apparatus, and this kind of massive escalation to bring the war on drugs kind of beyond the U.S. borders?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot more, particularly over the last year, this, merging of Department of Homeland Security operations and enforcement programs, with military programs. The Coast Guard is under Department of Homeland Security, and the Coast Guard, there's even been, quite a few, people in the Coast Guard or leaders or whistleblowers who have pushed back against all these resources being used for immigration enforcement, deportation type of purposes. And I think these strikes in the Caribbean is also, illustrative of the type of DHS operations that have been operating in the Caribbean for many years, including interdictions of boats of asylum seekers who are fleeing, trying to make their way, often folks from Haiti, from Cuba, are traveling in boats, trying to make their way to the U.S. And often these interdictions lead to direct turnbacks of people. Many people, die at sea trying to make this journey. And a lot of some folks end up in Guantanamo Bay, which has also gotten as much attention in, over the last year. Of course, the Trump administration, one of the first acts that they did, the second Trump administration, was to shore up the detention in Guantanamo Bay. So often people who are interdicted at sea by Coast Guard end up in Guantanamo, and are essentially largely disappeared in terms of not having access to counsel is incredibly difficult. And we've seen this merging with other agencies as well, like the Department of State, the contracts to incarcerate people in El Salvador. That was a State Department, contract. So I think it was around $10 million that the State Department gave El Salvador to incarcerate people there in their mega prisons. So I think what's happening in the Caribbean is reflective a lot of this, kind of merging of DHS operations, with other agencies, and then you have DHS, of course, now using military bases domestically for detention. So military bases like Fort Bliss is now one of the largest encampments for immigration detention. You have immigrants incarcerated there. There have been horrific deaths there, I believe 2 deaths, and just over the last year, and one of those was even ruled by a local coroner to be a homicide, which is pretty staggering. So you have the guard abuse so violent in these facilities that this is why there's been such an escalation of people dying in these facilities. So you see a lot of this merging, and that's why it's really pivotal to to restrict and slash the resources, particularly of DHS, because until Congress cuts back on the budgets for these agencies, DHS, of course, the military budget, and shifts those funds to actual community needs, we're going to continue to see this type of escalation and this type of militarization of DHS.
Well, Jesse, I learned so much from this interview. You are just like you have such a wealth of knowledge on all of this stuff. It is what you do for work. So I guess you should. But thank you so much for joining us to break all this down. Jesse Franzblau, Associate Director of Policy with the National Immigrant Justice Center. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, both. Really great to be with you both today.